Hello. Italics have been part of the Latin script typographical landscape for over 500 years, and yet their design has remained a mystery. There are many articles written about the history of particular italic designs, but very little about why they were designed that way. What influenced designer decisions? What processes did they use? And what does that process look like for designers in this century? I'm Victor Gaultney, a type designer with SIL International, and I also work with MA students at the University of Reading, helping them learn the craft of type design. And I want to share with you a brief look into the results of a 5-year research project at Reading to discover and document how designers create these secondary script Latin italics. Do they just slant the upright and make it curvy? Or is it more complex and nuanced? The full 270-page study will be published in a few months, but I want to give you a peek at what I've found. To give you some basic background, I looked at whatever I could find in the published literature about italic design, but also at type specimens, promotional materials, reviews, anything that might give clues to how the designer made decisions. Then I interviewed 23 current designers from a variety of backgrounds to see how their processes compare to historical patterns. And although there is no single common ideal process for creating an italic, in fact there's a wide variety, there is a general pattern, a set of 5 phases that describe what designers consider. And this framework for designing italics can be helpful as we look at existing italics, design new ones, and even consider whether the concept of italic has relevance for scripts other than Latin. So how do designers approach an italic design? What questions do they ask? What decisions do they need to make? These questions and decisions seem to cluster into 5 phases that begin sequentially but then continue in parallel as adjusting as necessary as new questions and factors arise and new decisions are made. And this process begins with establishing context, the purposes and boundaries of the design. It continues with style influences, how historical patterns, user expectations, current trends, and even business competition affect it. Then deciding about working methods, which design tools and techniques to use, both manual and digital, to create the letter forms. Now the first 3 are actually not unique to italics, but italic introduces additional complexities and challenges. The next 2 are unique to italic and focus on managing what I call italic tension. We'll get into that more in a few minutes. So choosing differentiation techniques, discovering the particular mix of techniques that will provide the needed amount of differentiation from the Roman, and then determining connection with the Roman, deciding how to provide a perceived sense of connectedness with the Roman. And managing italic tension is balancing these 2 factors, differentiation and connection. Now let's look at the 5 phases in more detail. And I'll do this as if you're designing a new italic and need to make design decisions, though it's really a reflection on what I discovered about the broad practice of designers. So the design process begins with asking, why is it needed? How will it be used? What technical requirements apply? And a key issue here is how much differentiation is required for how it will be used. In other words, how much does the italic need to stand out from the Roman? For example, consider Gary Munch's Candara, a design whose italic is very close to the upright Roman. It works beautifully for long passages, is highly readable, and this italic can be very similar to the Roman with no negative effects. But if you really need differentiation, it doesn't work very well. It doesn't stand out enough. And there were technical reasons why it was designed this way. So you may need to design something that stands out, that draws attention, something notably distinctive in slope, curvature, letter forms, proportions, features. Take a look at Janon's version of Guermond and Grandjean. This takes all of these to extremes to make it clear the difference between the words in the original text and the commentary. Now there may also be technical requirements that affect design choices. Will it be for print screen, web, mobiles, an extreme italic like this may be impractical on a mobile or a watch. So your first decisions are related to establishing the context, these requirements and boundaries. The next phase involves identifying style influences. One of these is the role of history. Established style correspondences that set expectations. If your upright is inspired by Didot, it's somewhat expected that your italic will follow a similar overall inspiration, even if the details are not identical. Though it's not always the case, you probably couldn't get away with using a humist sans. It would look too different, too disconnected. See, history provides a valuable and inescapable context for style decisions. Does the italic need to follow a particular style tradition, and how closely, or should it intentionally try to subvert that expectation? What will potential users want or expect? Now, italics can also have business purposes. They may have a role in promoting a type family. You may decide to put a beautiful virtuosic italic in with some lovely open type features into a font family, even though you may know it may not be used that much. But it can play a part in drawing attention to the family and increase interest. Personal taste also affects these style decisions, and this requires some personal introspection and some humility. What aspects of your personal preferences and taste as a designer are appropriate for this italic? And which might you need to avoid? Maybe you really like some quirky italic alternate forms, but would they really work in the newspaper face that you're designing? You need to consider these style factors, historical traditions, user expectations, commercial purposes, and even your own personal style and taste. Now, once you've established these, you need to decide how you're going to make the letter forms. Now, even though italic has a clear, unavoidable heritage in calligraphic forms, designers seem to rarely, if ever, use calligraphic techniques to shape the actual final outlines of the letter forms. Instead, they use tools like a pen or a brush to experiment with forms and to get ideas. Or they may use them to draw or sketch out ideas with a pencil and paper, or even on screen. Now, in many cases, the italic is just based directly on the Roman, digitally transformed and adjusted. Now, designers seem to use a similar process for this, although some of these steps are optional and are not always applied in the same order. They skew the letter forms, adjust the curves to reduce distortion. They may compress them, chop off the serifs, maybe optionally replace them, slightly reduce the stroke weight, tighten and adjust the spacing, replace the A and G and other forms with alternate italic forms. And then they may use these as the final forms, or they may use them as a general template or guide to proportions and draw fresh letters that replace them, maybe with greater curvature. So remember that this is not meant to be a standard recipe. It just illustrates a common sequence of ideas and techniques to consider. Now, most of these individual techniques are used to push the italic further and further away from the Roman, but without losing a perceived sense of connectedness. Now, Morrison, in his article Towards an Ideal Italic, got a lot of things wrong, and he later admitted it, like saying that the ideal italic was a sloped Roman. But he did identify the most significant issue in the design of italics, this tension between similarity and difference. And the next two phases in your italic design are all about managing that tension. Your first goal is to make the italic different enough from the Roman to achieve that level of differentiation that you identified was needed in the context phase. Now, there are 6 techniques that designers commonly use to do this, and we've talked about some of them, but here they are in order of most to least used. Now, I should note that these are not necessarily digital transformations. For example, deciding on the slope of letters is relevant whether you're drawing them by hand or digitally transforming them. And I'm presenting these with a hypothetical scale that indicates the potential range of using the technique and a rough indication of level, of how much it's commonly used. But please, do not consider these to be recommendations of the right amount to use. The most common way to make an italic different is to give it a slope. Typical range is 7 to 13 degrees, though it can go from none to 20 degrees. The slope may vary between widths, optical sizes, or even between individual letters. Cursiveness is a subjective style characteristic that evokes the feel of handwritten forms. Real or implied stroke connections between letters, a flowing or running texture, greater stroke curvature, things that harken back to the calligraphic tradition. Alternate forms may be used to introduce structural changes into the texture. And the most common are the single story A and G, but you could use others too, and they may be inspired by historical style influences. Flat serifs are often replaced with entry and exit strokes or terminals. Now these may differ in size or length or angle, and all of these aspects affect the amount of differentiation it gives. Italics are commonly compressed a little, around 2 to 4%, but that can vary widely, and in some cases compression is not appropriate, like for a monospace font. Finally, the actual proportions of the letters can change with or without width changes. Now you have to decide which of these to use and to what extent. The character and effectiveness of an italic is often determined by what mix or balance of techniques are used. If you use too few or are too restrained, then the italic may end up being too similar to the Roman. But maybe that's not a problem for its intended use. If you use too many and are extreme with them, then the italic may look unrelated to the Roman. However, even that can work, especially if there's some historical precedent. Your goal is to find that mix, that balance of techniques that gives you the right amount of differentiation. Start out with a guess of what is needed, then test and adjust. The increased use of one technique can be balanced by reducing another. Adding more slope and alternate forms may allow you to reduce the compression and yet retain a similar level of differentiation overall. Now in the final phase, connection, your goal is to keep the italic in harmony with the Roman and other family members despite what you've done to make them look different. Now there are 4 techniques that are commonly used to strengthen that perceived connectedness. And again, your decision is which of these to use and how much. And here we're going the other direction, pushing towards the Roman. Similar or identical letterform structures can strengthen the connection with the Roman, and the most clear example of this are capital letters. They may be simply sloped and adjusted Roman forms, even in italics that have strong cursive characteristics. Or there may be other structural connections, such as the same type of letter construction, like the interrupted or continuous construction as described by Nordsai. Equaling perceived height was one of the first techniques used to connect Roman and italic. Now sometimes when you slope forms, it can make them look taller. So some designers reduce them 1 to 3% until they look balanced in height. A designer may incorporate specific features or motifs from the Roman into the italic, serif details, stroke endings, height and position of joins, or some other notable motif like a ball terminal. These give the Roman and italic a similar aesthetic and flavor. And a final technique is to try and balance the weight to give a similar gray value. Now, this wasn't important historically. They often did not match. But it seems to be more common and desirable today. As with differentiation, your goal is to discover the best combination of techniques to use. You may, however, notice that your efforts to keep the italic connected with the Roman work against your efforts to differentiate them. Well, then you can go back and add in more differentiation. And managing italic tension is a matter of deciding how much these two pull against one another. You may end up with a high level of tension with strong differentiation balanced with strong connection. or a low level with only moderate levels of each. Both can work, and both can be effective. I presented this framework to you from the perspective of planning a new italic design, giving you an idea of what decisions you will face and what your options are. But the framework can be used in other ways too. You could use it to analyze an existing design, working backwards through the process. Take a look at an italic. Identify what characteristics it shares with the Roman, what techniques were used to achieve differentiation, maybe an idea of how the letters were formed. Note the particular characteristics that relate to historical models, and see how the designer addressed context requirements such as technical limits. You can also use this in evaluating the effectiveness of an italic, although that's a highly subjective thing. But this framework can be used to make it easier to look at specific details of the design and evaluate how each of them contributes to the success of the design for practical purposes. Now, this framework hints at some potential extensions, some further uses. A similar framework might be useful for other secondary styles such as bold. Establish the context, the purpose, the boundaries, how it will be used, look at established paradigms, historical style patterns, decide how to create the letter forms, how to add that weight on, then balance differentiation and connection. It also hints at how we might approach the concept of non-Latin italics. Italics are by nature a Latin script invention, and as such we should probably begin with the assumption that italics are inappropriate for other scripts. However, in reality, the global typographical world has been influenced by how the Latin script uses that useful secondary style and may want something similar. And there's also that I button in many apps, and people expect it will do something useful when you press on it, even for other scripts. Now, the key may be in identifying which aspects of Latin italics, such as specific differentiation techniques, slope, cursiveness, alternate forms, calligraphic influences, etc., make sense or are reasonably applicable to the specific script in a natural way, and which make no sense at all. We need to break out of this assumption that non-Latins need italics that are slanted and cursive. Now, I'd love to explore this in far greater depth and with other voices involved, but I don't have time in this presentation. This has been a far too brief look at the italic design process, but I hope it has encouraged you to look creatively and more deeply at the issues and influences, and broken down any assumption that creating an italic is always a simple slant and curve process, even though sometimes it is just that. Now, over the next few months, I'll be publishing articles that go into more detail, including the full study itself, and you can watch for them at gaultney.org/jvgtype, or follow me on Twitter at jvgtype. Thank you.